We're not getting out of this gorge alive. Commander Nate Grayson said those words to no one, and to every man bleeding beside him. 28 Navy SEALs pinned in a kill zone in eastern Afghanistan, surrounded by over 230 insurgents closing from every ridge. Radios jammed, no air support, ammunition draining by the minute, and somewhere above them, on a cliff the military had classified as unclimbable, a woman no one ever took seriously was crawling toward the only firing position that could save them all. Before we go further, if this story grips you, subscribe, follow this to the very end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to where it all began. 3 days before the ambush, the briefing room at Forward Operating Base Chapman smelled like burnt coffee and nervous sweat. Major Aaron Caldwell stood at the front, tapping a satellite image pinned to the wall. Fareed Nazari, Caldwell said, logistics king, moves weapons across the Pakistan border like Amazon moves packages. We've been hunting him for 11 months. Now we've got a 72-hour window. He's transiting through a village called Darwan, southeast Paktia province, Shahi Kot Valley. Commander Nate Grayson sat in the second row, arms crossed, eyes locked on the map. Blonde hair buzzed tight, jaw like a shovel blade. 11 years in special operations, 4 combat deployments. He'd lost exactly 2 men in his career, and both names were tattooed on his left forearm, where he could see them every time he checked his watch. What's the force package? Grayson asked. 28 operators, 2 Chinook insertion, 12 clicks out. You hump in under darkness, establish observation positions, confirm Nazari's presence, then capture or eliminate. Standard counterinsurgency package. And Overwatch? Caldwell glanced at his roster. Recon element, Lieutenant Brennan. She'll set up 300 meters behind your main body, provide eyes on approach routes. In the back of the room, Lieutenant Cassidy Brennan didn't look up from her notebook. She'd heard her name said that way before, like an afterthought, like someone remembering to add milk to a grocery list. She was used to it. 5'5", 126 pounds, brown hair pulled tight under a patrol cap. She had the kind of face people forgot 5 minutes after meeting her. Not ugly, not striking, just quiet in a way that made her disappear in any room full of operators. The nickname had started on her first deployment. Lieutenant Sam Draper had coined it during a pre-mission brief when Cassidy hadn't spoken for 45 minutes. You're so quiet, Brennan. I forget you're breathing. We should call you Whisper. The room had laughed. The name stuck. And over 3 deployments, it had hardened into something more than a joke. It had become a verdict. Cassidy Brennan was the sniper nobody trusted with critical shots. The operator nobody picked first for teams. The woman who watched through spotting scopes while men with half her qualification scores took the position she'd earned. She never complained. She never argued. She just kept shooting perfect scores on the range and climbing mountains on her leave time and waiting for someone, anyone, to notice. Nobody did. The insertion went clean. 2 CH-47 Chinooks dropped them 12 kilometers from Darwan at 0200 hours. 28 operators hit dirt, formed up, and began the long hump through broken terrain. Grayson led from the front, the way he always did. Lieutenant Dylan Mercer, his second in command, held the middle. Sergeant First Class Cole Hastings ran the rear. Cassidy split off with her spotter, Petty Officer Third Class Eddie Rowe, moving to their overwatch position on a low ridge 300 meters behind the main element. You think this one's real? Rowe asked as they settled into position. He was 23, freckled, new to the unit, eager in a way that hadn't been beaten out of him yet. What do you mean? Nazari, every time we get a lead on this guy, he's gone before we get there, like he knows we're coming. Cassidy adjusted her spotting scope. Maybe he does. That's not exactly comforting, Lieutenant. Wasn't meant to be. They reached their initial positions just before dawn. Darwan village materialized below them, a cluster of mud brick compounds arranged along a dry riverbed. From her ridge, Cassidy could see the whole layout through her scope. Women carrying water from the well, children kicking a ball through the dust. Men gathered outside the small mosque, talking, gesturing, doing all the things men in Afghan villages did every morning. But Cassidy's hands went cold on the scope. She'd watched dozens of villages through optics over 3 deployments. She knew what organic activity looked like, the randomness of real life, the way people moved without purpose or pattern, the small, unpredictable moments that made a village feel alive. This wasn't that. The women moved in rhythm. The children stayed in the same area, circling back when they drifted too far. The men outside the mosque gestured broadly, performing conversation rather than having it. It was choreography, a stage play designed to look normal from a distance. "Eddie," she said quietly, "what do you see down there?" Rose scanned the village. "Looks normal to me. Look at the women at the well. Count the trips." Roe watched for 2 minutes. His frown deepened. "They're cycling. Same route, same timing, like they're on a loop." "Because they are." Cassidy keyed her radio. "Command, Recon 3. Village activity patterns appear staged. Recommend holding main element for enhanced surveillance before advance." Static. Then Captain Leo Hargrove's voice, tight with impatience. "Recon 3, command. Negative. Your assessment is noted. Maintain position and observe." "Sir, the patterns are consistent with a rehearsed..." "Recon 3, I said maintain position. Do not clutter the command net with speculation. Command out." Cassidy released the radio button. Her jaw clenched so hard her teeth ached. "He's not listening," Rose said. It wasn't a question. "He never does." Through the scope, Cassidy watched the SEAL element advance into the valley mouth. 28 men moving in tactical formation through boulder-strewn terrain, heading toward a narrow gorge between 2 rocky ridges. Then she saw it. A flash of reflected light on the eastern ridge. Brief, sharp, the kind of glint that comes from glass or metal catching the early sun. She swung her scope toward it. Nothing. Just rocks and shadow. Then another flash. Western ridge this time, different position, different angle, and a third, higher up, almost directly above the route the SEALs were taking. "Command, Recon 3, her voice was urgent now, stripped of protocol politeness. "I have multiple possible hostile positions on high ground. East Ridge, West Ridge, and elevated center. Confirmed metallic signatures. Recommend immediate halt and reassessment. This is a kill zone." The response came back like a door slamming. "Recon 3, command. We have no confirmed hostiles on any sensor platform. You are observing reflected minerals or equipment glare. Maintain position. Maintain radio discipline. Command out." Cassidy lowered the radio. Her heart was hammering. "He's going to get them killed," she whispered. "What do we do?" Cassidy watched the SEAL element move deeper into the valley. The terrain was funneling them. The 2 ridges narrowed like the sides of a V, pushing the formation toward the gorge mouth. Classic ambush geometry. Any first-year tactical student could see it, but she was Whisper, the quiet one, the recon girl with the spotting scope. And Captain Hargrove had made his decision. "We watch," Cassidy said. The words tasted like ash. The first mortar round landed at 0647. It hit 30 meters ahead of the lead element with a detonation that punched a shockwave through the valley. Before the echo died, 2 more rounds bracketed the formation. 1 left, 1 right, perfectly placed to drive the SEALs toward the only available cover, the gorge. Then the machine guns opened up. 3 positions, East Ridge, West Ridge, elevated center. Exactly where Cassidy had reported metallic signatures 9 minutes earlier. Coordinated fire, pre-registered, every burst designed to herd rather than kill. The enemy wasn't trying to wipe them out immediately. They were pushing them into the box. Cassidy watched through her scope as the SEALs executed their immediate action drill. Textbook, beautiful, exactly what years of training produced. They returned fire, bounded to cover, established a defensive perimeter. But the perimeter kept shrinking. Every mortar round drove them deeper into the gorge. Every machine gun burst closed another avenue of retreat. Within 4 minutes, 28 of America's most elite warriors were compressed into a rocky depression barely 70 meters wide. "All units, command!" Grayson's voice erupted through the radio, tight with controlled urgency. "We are in heavy contact. Multiple enemy positions, east, west, and elevated. Estimate 200-plus combatants. Requesting immediate close air." The transmission cut to static. Cassidy tried her own radio. Dead. Every frequency. Nothing but the empty hiss of jammed airwaves. "They've got military-grade jammers," she said. "They planned this. Every step." Roe's face had gone white. 200? Did he say 200? At least. "And we can't call anyone." No. Roe looked at her, and in his eyes she saw the math that every operator learns to do and prays they never have to. 28 men, 200-plus enemy, no communications, no air support, ammunition finite and draining fast. "They're going to die down there," Roe said. Cassidy didn't answer. She was already pulling out her tactical map. In the gorge, Grayson pressed his back against a boulder and wiped blood from his left eye. Shrapnel from an RPG near miss had opened a cut above his eyebrow, and the blood kept running into his vision no matter how many times he cleared it. "East Ridge, 30-plus movers advancing in pairs," Mercer shouted from behind a rock 10 meters away. His rifle barrel was so hot the air above it was shimmering. "They've got our range dialed, Commander. Every time we shift, they adjust within seconds." "West flank's worse," Hastings called from the opposite side of the perimeter. "I count 40 on that side, leapfrogging forward, disciplined. These aren't local militia. These guys have training." "Comms?" Grayson yelled toward Chief Petty Officer Marcus Webb, who was hunched over the radio equipment behind a low rock wall. "Dead across all frequencies, sir. Military-grade jammers somewhere above us. I can't punch through. We're cut off." An RPG streaked overhead and detonated against the cliff face. The explosion sent a curtain of rock fragments raining down. Someone screamed. Petty Officer Jake Ellison, clutching his right leg. Blood was pulsing through his fingers in rhythmic spurts that meant arterial damage. Medic Specialist Torres was on him in seconds, hands moving with the mechanical precision of someone who's done this too many times. She got a tourniquet on, got pressure applied, got Ellison stabilized. Then she looked up at Grayson, and the expression on her face said everything her mouth didn't. "How long?" Grayson asked quietly. 40 minutes, maybe. He needs a surgeon, Commander, not a medic with a first aid kit." "Who else?" "Peters took shrapnel in the shoulder. He can still fight, but he's losing blood. Kowalski's got a concussion from the first mortar. He's seeing double. And Ramos," she hesitated. "Ramos needs to stop moving, but he won't." Grayson looked across the gorge at Corporal Danny Ramos, who was firing from a prone position despite the dark stains spreading across his left side. The kid was 22 years old, first deployment. He'd been so excited during the briefing that he'd asked 3 questions about the terrain. Now the terrain was killing him. "Commander," Hastings appeared at Grayson's shoulder, close enough to speak without shouting. His face was the face of a man delivering a death sentence. "The boys know, sir. I know they know. Morrison's doing the ammo count. We've got maybe 20 minutes of sustained fire. After that, we're throwing rocks." Grayson closed his eyes for 1 second. When he opened them, the calculation was done. 30 minutes, he said, maybe less. Once they complete the encirclement, and they will complete it, They'll pour fire from every direction simultaneously. We won't be able to cover all sectors. What do we do? Grayson looked at the men around him, men he'd trained with for years, men who trusted him enough to follow him into this valley, men who deserved to see their families again. We make them pay for every inch of this gorge, Grayson said, loud enough for the nearest operators to hear. Every round counts. Make them remember this fight for the rest of their lives. Nobody cheered. Nobody made speeches. They were SEALs. They understood exactly what he was saying. They were going to die here, but they were going to die well. 300 meters away and slightly above the valley floor, Cassidy Brennan was on her knees with a map spread across the rocks, her finger tracing contour lines while her mind ran calculations that terrified her. "There's nothing we can do," Rose said. He wasn't wrong. 2 people with rifles couldn't change the math of 200 against 28. Not from this position. Not from this angle. "Maybe not from here," Cassidy said. "What do you mean?" Her finger stopped on the map. "Cliff Formation 22 Alpha. The thin brown contour lines were packed so close together they almost merged. Military cartography's way of saying, this is a wall, not a slope. The terrain analysis printed beside it read, non-traversable, class 5 plus vertical exposure, no military application." "No," Rose said, reading over her shoulder. "No way. That's a sheer cliff. 400 meters of vertical, 380. 380 meters of loose shale and sandstone in the dark. You'd die on the first pitch." "Maybe." "Definitely." Cassidy looked at him. "If I get to the top, I have clear sight lines across the entire battlefield. I'd be above every enemy position. They'd have no idea where the fire was coming from because no one believes that cliff can be climbed." "Because it can't be climbed." "Eddie." Her voice was quiet, but something in it made Rose stop talking. "Those 28 men down there have 30 minutes to live. The radios are dead. Nobody's coming. Nobody even knows they're in trouble. If I stay here, I watch them die. All of them. Every single one. And if you fall, then I die trying instead of watching." Rose stared at her. He opened his mouth to argue, closed it, opened it again. "What do you need me to do?" "Stay here. Keep watching the battle. If the jammers go down, if you get any signal at all, even for a second, you call in everything. Every asset. Everything." "And you?" Cassidy was already stripping her pack. Water. Ammunition. 14 rounds for her M110. Sidearm with 2 spare magazines. A thin climbing rope. Chalk. Everything else got left on the rocks. She checked her rifle, chambered around, looked at Roe one more time. "If I don't make it, tell them I saw the ambush. Tell them I tried to warn them." "Cassidy." But she was already moving. Downslope first, into the shadows, then lateral across broken terrain toward the base of Cliff Formation 22 Alpha. Roe watched her disappear into the darkness. He was 23 years old, and he just watched someone walk toward almost certain death with the calm of a woman going to pick up groceries. "God help her," he whispered. "God help all of us." Cassidy reached the base of the cliff and looked up. In the darkness, Formation 22 Alpha was a wall of black rising into a sky full of stars. She could hear the wind moaning across its face, a deep, hollow sound, like air moving through a cathedral. She pressed her hand flat against the rock. Sandstone, cold, gritty, the kind of rock that could hold you or betray you without warning. Her father's voice came unbidden, floating up from 1,000 memories of Montana cliff faces and frozen waterfalls. "Read the rock, Cass. It'll tell you where to go if you listen. And if it says don't come, you listen to that too." The rock wasn't saying don't come, but it wasn't saying welcome either. She found the first handhold, a horizontal crack, solid, wedged her fingers in, placed her right foot on a small ledge, and pulled herself off the ground. 1 meter. 379 to go. The first 30 meters went as well as darkness and bad rock allowed. Cassidy climbed the way she'd learned in the Beartooth Mountains. Methodical, patient, always 3 points of contact, always testing before trusting. Her world narrowed to the next handhold, the next foothold, the next 3 feet of vertical progress. At 40 meters, her right hand closed on a ledge that looked solid. It exploded into fragments. Her body swung outward into open air. One hand, 2 feet scrambling against smooth rock. The valley floor was 130 feet below, far enough that she wouldn't feel the impact. Just a half second of falling, and then nothing. Her right foot caught a tiny ridge. She pressed down. It held. Her left hand found a crack and jammed into it so hard her knuckles split inside her gloves. She hung there, breathing, 4 stories above the ground, held by a toe and 3 fingers. Below, she could hear the gunfire from the gorge, a sound that had become the metronome of a countdown she couldn't stop. "Don't stop," she told herself. "They're dying while you hang here. Move." She moved. At 60 meters, the face went smooth, almost polished. She traversed left along a ledge the width of a boot sole, back pressed against the cliff, fingers reading the rock by feel because her eyes couldn't tell solid from hollow in the darkness. The ledge ended at a vertical crack, her only route up, too narrow for her body, barely wide enough for her hands. She wedged her fingers in, placed her feet on either side, and started chimneying upward. Her shoulders burned within the first 10 meters. Her shredded gloves were wet, sweat or blood she couldn't tell, and didn't care. The crack tore at her knuckles, her palms, her wrists. Every upward meter was a negotiation between muscle and gravity was winning. At 90 meters, she found a shallow cave, barely deeper than her body. She crawled into it, pressed against the back wall, and let herself shake. Her arms were trembling so violently she couldn't have gripped a coffee cup. Her shoulders felt like someone had driven railroad spikes through them. Her hands were raw meat inside disintegrating gloves, and she was only halfway up. Below, the gunfire had intensified. Even from here, she could see the muzzle flashes in the gorge, orange sparks flickering faster and more desperately. The SEALs were burning through their ammunition. 20 minutes, she whispered, maybe less. She pushed herself out of the cave and started climbing again. The final section was where the mountain tried to kill her. At 120 meters, the sandstone gave way to shale, loose, fractured, treacherous. Every handhold was a bet, and the odds were getting worse. Cassidy moved with extreme care, testing each grip 3 and 4 times before trusting her weight. She was 15 meters from the summit ridge when the shelf beneath her feet simply vanished. One moment she was climbing, the next she was falling. The sensation lasted less than a second before her right hand shot out, pure reflex, pure survival, and caught a protrusion of rock no bigger than a fist. Her body slammed to a stop. Her shoulder sockets took her full weight with a pain so intense her vision went white. The rock under her fingers began to crack. She could hear it, a slow, grinding fracture, like a bone breaking in slow motion. In 2 seconds, maybe 3, it would give way completely, and she would fall 120 meters onto jagged rock in total darkness, and no one would ever know what she'd tried to do. Her left hand reached up, found another hold. She pulled, shifting weight off the failing grip. Her right foot found a tiny ledge, inches wide, barely there. The rock under her right hand shattered, but she was already moving, already reaching, already climbing with the desperate animal energy of a body that has decided it is not ready to die. 7 minutes later, 7 minutes that erased every other experience of fear she'd ever known, Cassidy Brennan pulled herself over the summit ridge of Cliff Formation 22 Alpha. She collapsed face down on solid ground. Her body was shaking so hard she thought she might shake apart. Her hands were destroyed, torn gloves, split skin, blood mixing with chalk dust and grit. Her shoulders felt dislocated. Her legs were cramping. She gave herself 15 seconds. Then she crawled to the edge and looked down. The entire battlefield spread below her. The gorge, the ridges, the enemy positions, everything visible, everything exposed, every fighter who believed he was safe because the cliffs above him were unclimbable. Cassidy pulled her rifle forward, deployed the bipod between two rocks, settled in behind the scope. Through the magnified optic, she could see individual insurgent fighters moving between positions with the confidence of men who had already won. She could see muzzle flashes from the gorge, where 28 SEALs were fighting their last fight. She could see the mortar team adjusting for another barrage, the RPG crews preparing their next rounds, the squad leaders positioning their men for the final assault. They had no idea she was here. Nobody knew she was here. Her finger found the trigger. She took one long breath, released half, found the stillness between heartbeats, and she whispered the words her father had said before every critical shot since she was 12 years old. Make it count. The enemy sniper on the eastern ridge fired twice more into the gorge before Cassidy found him through her scope. He was good, disciplined. He moved between three positions with the patience of a man who'd killed before and planned to keep killing all night. 2 shots from one spot, shift left behind cover, reappear 10 meters away, fire again. Every round aimed, not sprayed. Every movement calculated. Through her optic, Cassidy watched him settle into his third position. He pressed his cheek to the stock, adjusted his scope, and began to steady his breathing for the next shot. She didn't know which SEAL he was aiming at. She didn't need to. Range, 851 meters. Wind from the northwest, gusting and swirling unpredictably through the valley. Target elevated roughly 40 meters above her, meaning she needed to compensate for the downward angle. Cold barrel, her first round, the most important and least predictable shot a sniper can take. Her father's voice came from somewhere deep. The first shot tells the enemy everything, Cass. Where you are, what you can do. Make damn sure it tells them to be afraid. Cassidy controlled her breathing. Slow inhale, slow release. She found the space between heartbeats, that fraction of stillness when the human body stops vibrating and the crosshair holds true. The enemy sniper paused, settled his own breathing, began to squeeze. Cassidy squeezed first. The M110 kicked against her shoulder. Through the scope, the enemy sniper jerked backward and collapsed behind his rocks. His rifle slid down the slope and came to rest against a boulder. 1. She was already traversing left. Target 2 materialized. A man in tactical gear standing on a rock outcrop, gesturing commands to a squad of fighters below him. His posture screamed authority. Squad leader, maybe higher. He stood exposed because he believed he was beyond the reach of the dying men in the gorge below. Range, 923 meters. She adjusted for the wind shift, placed the crosshair right and high. Fired. He dropped like someone had cut his spine. The fighters below him froze, 5 men staring at the empty rock where their commander had been alive 1 second ago. 2. Now confusion rippled through the enemy positions. Cassidy could see fighters scrambling, heads turning, weapons swinging toward threats that didn't exist. 2 of their best had dropped within 15 seconds. The shots hadn't come from the gorge. The angles were impossible, but there was nothing above them except cliffs that couldn't be climbed. Cassidy shifted 3 meters left to a different shooting port between the rocks. Target 3, a 2-man PKM machine gun crew on the western ridge, pouring sustained fire into the SEAL perimeter. The gunner's head and shoulders were visible above a hasty sandbag wall. Range, 791 meters. She fired. The gunner slumped forward. The assistant grabbed for the weapon, and Cassidy chambered and fired again before he could get his hands on the trigger mechanism. 4. She could feel something shift in the battle below, a change in rhythm, like a heart skipping a beat. The relentless hammering pressure on the SEAL position suddenly had gaps in it. Through her scope, she watched operators reposition, redistribute ammunition, pull wounded into better cover. They didn't know why the fire had eased, but they knew how to use it. Cassidy began hunting force multipliers, not random fighters, the men who made the enemy function as a unit, the connective tissue that held 200 individuals together as a coordinated killing machine. Shot 5. A radio operator pressing a handset to his ear, relaying position reports. His radio went dead when he did. Shot 6. An RPG gunner kneeling behind a boulder, tube on his shoulder, lining up a shot that could have killed 4 SEALs sheltering behind thin rock. Cassidy's round hit him before his finger found the trigger. The unfired rocket slid from the tube and clattered harmlessly down the slope. Shot 7. A squad leader rallying fighters on the western ridge, trying to fill the gap left by the dead machine gun crew. She let him stand just high enough to wave his men forward. Shot 8. A mortar crew adjusting their tube for another barrage. She shot the mortarman first. When the assistant looked up, she chambered and fired again. 10 rounds, 10 kills, and the battle below was tilting, but not breaking. Through her scope, Cassidy watched the enemy adapt. Fighters moved to covered positions. They pressed tight against rocks, reduced their profiles, stopped standing in the open. The shouted commands across the valley changed. Less arrogant, more urgent, but still organized. Someone was still holding this force together, and someone was looking for her. 2 fighters on the southern ridge had pulled out binoculars and were systematically scanning the cliff faces. Methodical, patient, dividing their search into sectors and working each one carefully. They hadn't found her yet, but they were looking in the right general direction, and they were getting closer with every sweep. She shot them both, rounds 11 and 12. Then she pulled back from her scope and did the math she'd been avoiding. 2 magazines left, 20 rounds, over 180 enemy fighters still operational. The battle was far from over, and she was running out of bullets. Every single shot from this point forward had to be perfect. Not just accurate, strategically perfect. Every trigger pull had to remove a capability that couldn't be replaced by the next man picking up a dead man's weapon. Down in the gorge, Commander Nate Grayson was experiencing something he hadn't felt in over an hour. Confusion. The good kind. "What the hell is happening up there?" Mercer shouted, pressing himself against a boulder as he swapped magazines. "The eastern sniper's gone. The western gun's gone. The mortar's stopped." "I have no idea," Grayson said. "Someone's shooting at them," Hastings said, crawling toward them with his rifle cradled in his elbows. "Single shots. Everyone's a kill. I've been listening between our own fire. Same weapon signature every time. One rifle. One shooter." "From where?" Hastings pointed upward, toward 22 Alpha, toward the impossible cliff. Grayson looked up into the darkness. Nobody could climb that. Nobody. As if answering him, another crack echoed across the valley. A fighter on the northern ridge pitched sideways and tumbled out of his position. "Well, somebody did," Mercer said quietly. "Commander," Hastings' voice dropped, "whoever's up there isn't just shooting, they're selecting targets. I've watched the pattern. They took out the sniper first, then the machine gun, then the mortar crew, then the radio men. This is someone who understands force structure, someone with tactical training." Grayson processed that. One person, on top of an unclimbable cliff, systematically dismantling a 200-man ambush force with aimed fire and tactical intelligence. "Use it," he ordered. "I don't care who it is or how they got up there. Redistribute ammo, consolidate wounded, move Ellison and Peters to the deepest cover we've got. If this shooter can keep the pressure off for another 20 minutes..." "Ellison doesn't have 20 minutes, sir," Torres interrupted from where she crouched over the wounded petty officer. Her hands were red to the wrists. "I've retightened the tourniquet twice. His blood pressure's crashing. If we don't get him to a surgeon..." "I know." Sir, he's got maybe 15 minutes. I know, Torres. The medic held his gaze, not challenging, just making sure he understood what she was telling him. Grayson understood. 15 minutes for Ellison, maybe 20 minutes of ammunition. One unknown shooter buying time on a cliff that shouldn't be possible. Pray, Hastings said. No one laughed because he wasn't joking. 400 meters above them, Cassidy had stopped praying and started problem solving. She just fired her 15th round. A fighter who'd started climbing toward her position on the southern approach. An individual operator who'd figured out the angles on his own. When she saw the three-man team, they moved nothing like the man she just killed. They moved like soldiers. Tactical bounds, cover to cover, proper spacing, rifles up. One moved, while two covered. Then the next. Then the next. Leapfrogging up the southern slope with the kind of efficiency that came from real training and real combat experience. They'd identified her general position, and they were coming to kill her. 7 minutes, maybe 6. The slope wasn't as steep on the southern approach. That's why it was the obvious route, and that's why she'd set up her position to cover the northern angles instead. A mistake. The kind of mistake that got people killed. Cassidy made a decision in 2 seconds. She acquired the lead climber through her scope. Range, 409 meters, closing. He was good, using every shadow, every fold of terrain. But moonlight caught the metal receiver of his rifle for half a heartbeat. Half a heartbeat was enough. She placed the crosshair on the glint and waited for him to pause between movements. He stopped behind a rock, scanned upward, and prepared to move again. She fired. He tumbled backward, rolling down the slope. The other two vanished behind cover so fast it was like watching men dissolve into stone. 16. 16 rounds fired, 16 kills. 12 rounds remaining. Cassidy grabbed her rifle and moved. Fast. 40 meters along the ridgeline, staying below the crest, feet finding their way over loose rock in the darkness. She found her secondary position, a different set of boulders, a different angle on the valley. She set up, settled in, found the gorge through her scope. The two remaining climbers were still coming. They'd split up, one moving left, one right, flanking, trying to approach her from 2 directions at once. Smart and terrifying. She didn't have time to deal with them yet. Below, the enemy was consolidating. Through her scope, she watched 50 or more fighters gathering in a ravine north of the gorge. Squad leaders were organizing them, building an assault formation, pointing toward the SEAL perimeter, getting ready for a final push that would overrun the gorge with sheer numbers. If that assault launched, it was over. Shot 17. The man organizing the assault. He stood on a rock, pointing, directing, leading. A natural commander. The kind of man who held other men together through the force of his personality. Cassidy watched him gesture emphatically toward the gorge, watched fighters respond to his energy, watched the assault take shape around his will. She put her round through his chest. He dropped. The fighters around him scattered, confused, leaderless for the second time in 10 minutes. The assault's momentum shattered. Men who'd been ready to charge suddenly had no one telling them to charge. And without that voice, the individual survival instinct won out over collective aggression. She'd bought the gorge maybe 5 more minutes, 5 minutes of life for 28 men. It was everything she had. Behind her, boots on rock, close, much closer than they should have been. Cassidy rolled away from her rifle and drew her sidearm in one fluid motion. Muscle memory so deeply embedded, it bypassed her conscious mind entirely. Her body was moving before her brain finished processing the sound. The first climber came over a rock formation 12 meters away. His rifle was up, muzzle sweeping the position where she'd been lying half a second before. He was fast, trained, the kind of fighter who'd done this before. But Cassidy was no longer in that position. She fired 3 times from behind a low boulder. The rounds hit center mass. The climber's legs buckled, and he went down hard, his rifle clattering against stone. Movement left. Immediate. She threw herself sideways as bullets struck the rocks above her. Sharp, vicious impacts that sent stone fragments slicing across her neck and cheek. She hit the ground, rolled, came up in a crouch behind a different boulder, sidearm extended, breathing hard. Through a narrow gap between rocks, she could see the second climber repositioning. He'd seen her muzzle flash and was moving to flank her. Smooth, professional, dangerous. He was probably better than her at close quarters combat. Bigger, stronger, more experienced in this kind of knife fight, distance gunfight. But Cassidy had grown up hunting in the Beartooth Mountains, where her father had taught her the most important rule of stalking. The prey that moves first dies first. Let the other animal come to you. Let them make the mistake. You just have to be patient enough to wait for it. She waited. 2 seconds. 3. The climber moved. 1 step past the gap in the boulders, his rifle leading, sweeping the spot where she'd been. She fired 4 times. He fell against the rocks and slid down. Silence. Wind. The distant roar of combat below. Cassidy checked for more threats. Nothing. She scrambled back to her rifle, settled in, found the gorge. She'd been off the primary weapon for 90 seconds. In 90 seconds, the world had changed. The enemy assault had launched. Not the organized, coordinated push she disrupted. This was something worse. Desperate, angry. The remaining fighters had seen their leaders fall, seen their careful plan disintegrate, and instead of retreating, they'd done what cornered, furious men sometimes do. They charged. Fighters were pouring down both ravines toward the SEAL perimeter. Close range, some within 100 meters. The gorge was a wall of noise. Every SEAL weapon firing continuously, a sound so dense it merged into a single roar. Through her scope, Cassidy saw Grayson standing upright behind a boulder, firing controlled bursts, moving between positions, directing his men with hand signals because his voice couldn't carry over the gunfire. She saw Hastings dragging a wounded operator behind cover with one arm, while firing his sidearm with the other. She saw Torres crouched over Ellison, hands still pressing a dressing into his leg, still working, still refusing to stop even as rounds cracked off the rocks beside her head. She saw Ramos, young Ramos, first deployment Ramos, firing from a prone position with a dark stain on his left side now spreading past his belt. He was dying, and he was still fighting, and he was 22 years old. Cassidy began firing. No more careful selection, no more surgical precision. Fast aimed shots. Acquire, press, chamber. Acquire, press, chamber. Shot 18 caught a fighter mid-stride, 30 meters from the perimeter. He went down and the man behind him stumbled over his body. Shot 19 dropped an RPG gunner who'd shouldered his weapon and was aiming at the rock wall sheltering 5 SEALs. The rocket would have killed them all. He died with his finger on the trigger, and the round went wild into empty sky. 20, 21, 22. The assault wavered. Fighters who'd been running forward suddenly found their comrades dropping from an angle that made no tactical sense, from a direction that didn't exist on their battlefield map. The charge lost momentum. Men dove for cover, unable to process an enemy they couldn't see or locate. Cassidy's magazine ran dry. She dropped it, slammed her last one home. 8 rounds. 8 rounds between 28 men in annihilation. She made every one of them count. 23. A squad leader standing in the open, screaming at his fighters to keep pushing. He understood that momentum was their only weapon now. He was right, and he died knowing he was right. 24. 25. Come on, she whispered through cracked lips. Come on, somebody, please. 26. Another fighter who'd gotten too close to the perimeter. 70 meters, close enough for the SEALs to engage with their own weapons. But in the chaos, no one had seen him. Cassidy saw him. Cassidy stopped him. Then she found the commander, the overall commander of the entire ambush force. He stood on a ridge east of the gorge, surrounded by 3 bodyguards. He was losing control, and he knew it. His operation, weeks of planning, hundreds of fighters, jammers and mortars and coordinated fire plans, was disintegrating around him. Through her scope, Cassidy could see the desperation in his movements. He grabbed fighters by their vests, shoved them toward the battle, screamed orders that fewer and fewer men were following. Range, 1,147 meters. Cassidy had 5 rounds left. She'd never made a confirmed kill past 1,000 meters in combat. The range pushed her rifle to its absolute limit. At that distance, the bullet would be in the air for nearly 1.5 seconds. Time enough for the wind to push it a full meter off course. Time enough for the target to scratch his nose, turn his head, take 1 step in any direction. If she missed, the commander might rally his force. One strong voice could turn a retreat back into an attack. Miss, and the SEALs would die. Hit, and the enemy might break completely. She settled into her position, forced her breathing to slow despite the adrenaline that made her hands vibrate against the stock. Through the scope, she studied the commander's pattern. He was animated, constant motion, gesturing, shouting, physically pushing men into position. But every 15 seconds or so, a fighter would run up to report. The commander would stop to listen. Maybe 2 seconds of relative stillness, maybe less. 2 seconds at 1,147 meters. Her father had a name for shots like this. He called them covenant shots. The kind where you made a deal with physics and wind and gravity and whatever else was out there, and you held up your end, and you hoped like hell the universe held up its end too. The wind gusted hard from the northwest. Cassidy waited. The commander gestured sharply at a group of fighters, shoved one forward. Then a messenger ran up, breathless, pointing toward the southern ridge where Cassidy had killed the 3-man team. The commander turned to listen. 1 second. Cassidy placed her crosshair high and right of center mass, compensating for distance, wind, elevation, temperature, the rotation of the earth. Everything she knew. Everything her father had taught her. Everything 10 years of military training had built into her bones, in hands, in breath. 2 seconds. She fired. The bullet left the barrel at 830 meters per second. It climbed, then fell. The wind pushed it left, then right. At 600 meters, gravity was pulling it earthward hard. At 900, the trajectory was a plunging curve. At 1,147 meters, the bullet arrived. Through the scope, she saw the commander's body snap backward. He crumpled. His bodyguards scrambled to him, hands pressing, heads turning wildly in every direction. But there was nothing to find, nothing to shoot back at, nothing but an unclimbable cliff, and a woman the entire military had written off as too small and too quiet to matter. The shouted commands across the valley stopped. For the first time in over an hour, the battlefield went quiet enough for Cassidy to hear her own heartbeat. And then, beneath that heartbeat, growing louder with every second, another sound. A deep, rhythmic thumping that came from the east. A sound that every soldier in Afghanistan knew the way a drowning man knows the sound of a thrown rope. Rotors. Helicopter rotors. Cassidy pressed her forehead against the cold metal of her rifle and closed her eyes. Her hands were shaking so hard the weapon rattled against the bipod. She had 4 rounds left. Her gloves were destroyed. Her hands were bleeding. Her shoulders felt like they'd been pulled from their sockets and shoved back in crooked. But that sound. She opened her eyes and looked through the scope one more time. In the gorge, she could see Grayson's head turn eastward. She could see Mercer grab Hastings's arm and point. She could see, even from this distance, even through optics, the moment when 28 men who'd accepted they were going to die realized they might not. And somewhere inside Cassidy Brennan, in the place where fear and exhaustion and the weight of 43 lives had compressed her into something harder than the rock she was lying on, something cracked open. Not relief, not yet. The helicopters were still minutes away, and minutes were lifetimes in this valley. But something. She wiped her eyes with the back of a shredded glove, chambered her second-to-last round, and found the valley through her scope again. There were still RPG teams repositioning, still fighters with the means to bring down an aircraft. 4 rounds, 4 more kills between those helicopters in the ground. Cassidy breathed in, breathed out. "Almost done," she whispered. "Almost done. Hold together." She didn't know if she was talking to the SEALs or to herself. The first Black Hawk cleared the eastern ridgeline at 200 knots, nose down, rotors chopping the air with a sound that hit the valley like a war drum. The door gunner was already firing before the aircraft leveled out, tracer rounds arcing into enemy positions on the northern slope, orange streaks that carved through the darkness. Cassidy tracked the helicopter through her scope and felt her chest constrict. They were coming in fast, aggressive, the way pilots fly when they know the situation on the ground is desperate. But fast and aggressive also meant exposed. The Black Hawk had to slow down to deploy ropes. Slowing down meant hovering. Hovering over a valley full of RPG teams meant dying. She swung her scope right, northern ridge. An RPG gunner was already kneeling, tube on shoulder, leading the helicopter with his weapon the way a hunter leads a duck. He was tracking the aircraft's approach path, waiting for it to slow. Cassidy had 4 rounds left. Range, 671 meters. Wind still swirling but lighter now. She placed the crosshair on the RPG gunner's torso and fired. He pitched sideways. The RPG tube clattered against the rocks, unfired. The loader beside him grabbed for the weapon, tried to shoulder it, tried to find the helicopter in his sights. Cassidy chambered and fired. The loader dropped across his dead partner. 2 rounds left. A second RPG team appeared on the eastern ridge. 2 men scrambling into position, working with the frantic speed of fighters who knew the helicopters meant the end of everything they'd planned. One man loaded the tube, the other shouldered it and aimed. Cassidy traversed right. Range, 712 meters. She fired. The gunner dropped. The loader looked up, not at the sky, not at the gorge, but straight toward the cliff where Cassidy was lying. For one frozen moment, through the scope, their eyes almost met. He knew. He'd figured out where the shots were coming from. She fired her last round. He fell. Empty magazine, empty rifle. 43 rounds fired since she'd pulled herself over the summit ridge. 43 enemy fighters dead. Cassidy lowered her weapon and watched. In the gorge, Commander Grayson heard the Blackhawks and did something he hadn't done in over an hour. He started planning for survival instead of death. "Ropes coming down," he shouted. "Wounded first. Torres, get Ellison ready to move. Hastings, Mercer, cover the extraction. Everyone else, suppressive fire on anything that moves above us." "Ghost Actual, Reaper 4-1, a voice crackled through Grayson's radio. Broken, static-laced, but real. The signal jammers were failing as enemy positions collapsed. "Inbound your position. ETA 90 seconds. Mark your perimeter." Grayson grabbed his radio like a lifeline. "Reaper 4-1, Ghost Actual. Horseshoe Gorge. Friendlies at the floor only. Everything above us is hostile. Be advised, we have multiple wounded, 1 critical. We need a basket for extraction." "Copy, Ghost. Starting our run. Second bird right behind us." The lead Black Hawk thundered over the gorge and the world changed. The door-mounted M240 opened up with a sustained burst that sent enemy fighters diving for cover across the western ridge. The aircraft banked, circled, came back for another pass. Behind it, the second helicopter was already descending, nose up, bleeding speed. "Ropes!" someone shouted. 2 thick nylon lines dropped from the hovering Black Hawk, swinging in the rotor wash. Torres had Ellison on a litter. His face was gray. His eyes were half closed. The tourniquet on his leg was soaked through with blood that had turned dark. "Jake," Torres said, slapping his cheek lightly. "Jake, stay with me. Ride's here. You're going home." Ellison's eyes opened. He tried to speak, coughed, tried again. Tell my wife. Tell her yourself you're going home. Hastings and Mercer grabbed the litter and moved toward the ropes. A burst of fire kicked up dirt 2 meters from Mercer's feet. A fighter on the northern ridge who hadn't gotten the message that this battle was over. Grayson put 3 rounds into the fighter's position, then 3 more, walking his fire across the rocks until the incoming fire stopped. Move, now! They hooked Ellison's litter to the first rope. The crew chief above hauled it up with mechanical efficiency. This wasn't his first hot extraction, and the speed of his hands said he knew exactly how many seconds they had before someone got lucky with an RPG. Peters went up next, right arm hanging useless from the shrapnel wound, left hand gripping the rope. Then Kowalski, still seeing double from his concussion, guided onto the rope by 2 teammates who physically placed his hands. "Commander!" Mercer yelled over the rotor wash. "Ramos won't come!" Grayson turned. Corporal Danny Ramos was still in his firing position, still shooting, still bleeding from the wound in his left side that had spread across half his uniform. Grayson crossed the 10 meters between them at a dead run, staying low. He dropped beside Ramos and grabbed his shoulder. "Ramos, we're extracting! Let's go!" "Still got targets, sir." Ramos fired 2 more rounds. His hands were shaking so badly the rounds went wide, but he chambered and aimed again. "I can still fight." "Danny." Grayson used his first name, something he almost never did in the field. "Danny, look at me." Ramos turned. His face was chalk white. His lips were blue. His eyes had the glassy, unfocused look of a man losing blood faster than his body could compensate. "You did your job, son. You fought like hell. Now let me get you on that bird." Ramos opened his mouth to argue. Then his eyes rolled back and his body went limp. Grayson caught him before he hit the ground, scooped him up in a fireman's carry. Ramos weighed maybe 160 pounds, but felt like nothing. Felt like carrying a child, and ran toward the ropes. "Take him!" Grayson shouted up at the crew chief. "He's lost a lot of blood. Get a line in him the second he's aboard." The crew chief grabbed Ramos and pulled him into the aircraft with one arm. 20 years of doing this, and his face still tightened when he saw how young the kid was. One by one, the SEALs went up. The second Black Hawk moved into position, deploying its own ropes. The first aircraft's door gunner maintained continuous fire on the ridges, keeping enemy heads down. Spent brass cascaded from the helicopter like gold rain. Webb went up, then Foster, then Martinez, who'd been fighting with a piece of shrapnel the size of a car key embedded in his thigh for the last 45 minutes without telling anyone. He pulled himself up the rope one-handed because his other hand was pressing a bandage against the wound. Mercer went up, Hastings went up, one after another, exhausted men grabbing ropes and hauling themselves towards safety, their arms running on nothing but adrenaline and the desperate primal need to live. Grayson was the last man on the ground. He stood alone in the gorge for 5 seconds. 5 seconds with bullets still cracking off the rocks around him. 5 seconds looking at the blood-stained stones, the scattered brass, the torn equipment, the evidence of the worst hour of his professional life. Then he looked up, not at the helicopter, higher, up at the cliff face that rose above everything, invisible in the darkness, impossible and real. "Whoever you are," he said quietly, "thank you." He grabbed the rope and went up. The Black Hawks banked hard, engines screaming, gaining altitude. Door gunners fired continuous bursts as the aircraft climbed above effective range of ground fire. Tracers arced downward, keeping the remaining enemy fighters pinned while the helicopters pulled away. They were clear. 28 men who'd been minutes from death were strapped into 2 helicopters heading east at 160 knots. Medics worked on Ellison and Ramos. Torres finally let herself sit down, her blood-covered hands trembling in her lap. Mercer leaned his head against the bulkhead and closed his eyes. Hastings stared at the floor with the hollow expression of a man whose body had left the battle, but whose mind was still in it. Grayson sat across from the door gunner, watching the valley shrink behind them. His radio was working again, intermittent, scratchy, but functional. Command, Ghost Actual. Ghost Actual command, go ahead. 28 personnel extracted, multiple wounded, 2 critical. We need surgical teams standing by. Copy, Ghost. Medical is alerted. Commander, what happened out there? Grayson looked around the helicopter at his men. Alive, bleeding, broken, exhausted, but alive. We were ambushed. 200+ enemy. Signal jammers killed our comms. No air support. We were overrun. He paused. We were saved by a single shooter on the cliff above us, from a position rated unclimbable. I don't know who it was, but they killed at least 40 enemy fighters from that position and prevented an RPG strike on our extraction aircraft. Silence on the radio, then. Say again, Ghost Actual. Single shooter? Single shooter. I need to know who's still on the ground out there. Someone from my recon element. Check Recon 3's last known position. A long pause. Ghost Actual. Recon 3 is Lieutenant Cassidy Brennan. Her spotter, Petty Officer Rowe, is at the original Overwatch position. He reports Lieutenant Brennan departed his position approximately 90 minutes ago, on foot. Solo. He says she climbed the cliff. Grayson closed his eyes. The quiet one. The woman his team called Whisper. The sniper nobody trusted with primary shots because she was too small, too silent, too easy to forget. Get her out of there, he said. Send the bird back. Get her out now. Working it, Commander. Grayson set the radio down. Hastings was watching him from across the aircraft. Brennan? Hastings said. The recon sniper? Whisper? Yeah. Hastings leaned back. Something moved across his face. Not surprise, not disbelief, but something closer to shame. The kind of shame that comes from realizing you've been looking at someone for years and never actually seeing them. She climbed 22 Alpha, Hastings said, solo, in the dark. Yeah, and she's still up there. Grayson didn't answer. He pressed his forehead against the cold metal of the helicopter's hull and listened to the rotors and tried not to think about a woman alone on a cliff in enemy territory with no ammunition and shredded hands. On the summit of Cliff Formation 22 Alpha, Cassidy Brennan sat with her back against a boulder and let the shaking take her. It wasn't fear. The fear had burned out somewhere around the 400th meter of the climb, replaced by something colder and harder that had carried her through 47 minutes of sustained combat. Now that colder thing was burning out too, and what was left underneath was just a body, exhausted, injured, dehydrated, and suddenly, terrifyingly alone. The helicopters were gone. The valley below was quieting, sporadic gunfire as remaining enemy fighters retreated or regrouped. She could hear voices in the distance, shouting in Pashto, the sound of men trying to understand what had happened to their perfect ambush. Cassidy looked down at her hands. Her gloves were destroyed, shredded fabric and exposed skin, split knuckles, blood dried brown and cracking. She tried to flex her fingers and pain shot up both arms so sharply she gasped. She had no ammunition. Her rifle was empty. Her sidearm had 2 rounds. She'd used the rest on the climbers. Her radio was dead, killed by the same jammers that had cut off the seals, and she had no idea if the jammers were still active or if anyone even knew she was here. She was alone on top of an unclimbable cliff in a valley full of enemy fighters who were very, very angry about what had just happened to them. Well, Dad, she said to no one, this is a situation. The descent was the part she'd been trying not to think about. Going up a cliff in darkness was dangerous. Going down the same cliff with destroyed hands, exhausted muscles, and no rope was something else entirely. The kind of something else that climbing instructors describe with the word fatal. But staying wasn't an option. Dawn was coming. When the sun came up, her position on the summit would be visible from every ridge in the valley. Any remaining fighters with binoculars would see her, and then they'd come, lots of them. Cassidy stood up, her legs almost buckled. She locked her knees, waited for the dizziness to pass, and walked to the edge of the cliff. Looking down made her stomach drop into her boots. The route she'd climbed was invisible in the darkness. She could see only the first few meters of rock face before it vanished into black. Somewhere down there were the handholds she'd used on the way up. Somewhere down there was the ledge that had crumbled, the crack she'd chimneyed through, the shelf that had collapsed and nearly killed her. She had to go back down through all of it, blind, with hands that couldn't grip a coffee mug. 380 meters, she said. That's all. 380 meters and then flat ground. You've done harder climbs. She hadn't. She'd never done a harder climb in her life, and she'd never attempted a down climb on a route this severe without proper equipment and a partner. But the alternative was dying on this ridge when the sun came up. Cassidy turned, lowered herself over the edge, and began the descent. The first 50 meters took 40 minutes. She moved by feel, hands searching for holds she remembered from the ascent, feet testing every ledge before committing weight. Her fingers screamed with every grip. The torn skin on her palms reopened, and she could feel blood making the rocks slippery under her ruined gloves. At the chimney crack, she wedged herself in and down-climbed the narrow gap with her back against one wall and her feet against the other. The technique required constant pressure from her shoulders that had already been pushed past their limit by the ascent and 43 shots from a heavy rifle. Halfway down the chimney, her left arm gave out. It didn't cramp. It didn't weaken gradually. It simply stopped working, the muscles reaching some absolute limit and shutting down like a circuit breaker, tripping. Her body swung sideways, held only by her feet and her right arm, and for 3 seconds she hung in the darkness, waiting to see if she was going to fall 200 meters onto rocks. Her feet held. She pressed her back against the wall, took the weight off her arm, and waited. 10 seconds. 20. Feeling returned to her left arm, tingling, then pain, then function. She continued down. At the traverse, the ledge barely wider than a boot sole, she moved with the excruciating slowness of someone walking a tightrope over an abyss. Each step was a full commitment, a complete transfer of weight from one foot to the other, with nothing beneath her but darkness and distance. Her right foot slipped, just half an inch, but half an inch on a ledge 4 inches wide is everything. Her body tilted outward, balance shifting toward the void, and for one crystalline instant she felt herself going. Her left hand shot out and found the rock face. Not a hold, just flat stone, but the friction of her bleeding palm against rough sandstone was enough to stop her momentum. She pressed herself flat against the cliff, cheek against cold rock, and breathed. "Not yet," she said through clenched teeth. "Not yet, not after everything, not after 43, not yet." She kept going. The last 30 meters were the worst because they were the easiest. The slope eased enough that a fall wouldn't necessarily kill her. It would just break bones, leave her crippled in a valley full of enemies. The temptation to rush was almost overwhelming. Her body wanted to be done. Her mind wanted solid ground. Every instinct screamed to go faster, to get off this cliff, to stop hurting. She didn't rush. Her father had taught her that more climbers died in the last 10% of a descent than in the rest combined. Tired muscles, false confidence, the mental relaxation that comes from seeing the end, all of it killed. So she moved slowly, tested every hold, breathed deliberately, and then her feet touched flat ground. Cassidy collapsed, not gracefully, not heroically. She simply stopped being vertical and became horizontal, her body hitting the rocky valley floor with a gracelessness that would have been embarrassing if anyone had been watching. She lay there. The stars overhead were starting to fade as dawn approached. The eastern sky had the faintest blush of gray. She gave herself 60 seconds. Then she stood up, oriented herself by the fading stars, and began walking toward the extraction coordinates. She'd covered maybe 200 meters when she heard the rotors again. The Black Hawk appeared over the eastern ridge, moving fast, running lights off. It banked toward her, descended and settled onto a flat area 50 meters ahead, its rotor wash kicking up a storm of dust and gravel. A figure jumped from the aircraft before the skids fully touched ground. Commander Grayson. He walked toward her with the deliberate pace of a man approaching something he couldn't quite believe was real. Behind him, Mercer and Hastings dropped from the helicopter and followed. Cassidy kept walking, one foot in front of the other. She was covered in rock dust and dried blood. Her uniform was torn in a dozen places. Her gloves were hanging off her hands in strips. She was carrying an empty rifle because she'd forgotten to leave it on the ridge, and her sidearm hung at her side with its 2 remaining rounds. Grayson stopped 3 meters in front of her. He stared at her. She stared back. "You," he said. "Sir, you climbed 22 Alpha." "Yes, sir." "In the dark." "Wasn't much choice, sir." Grayson opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "How many, Lieutenant?" 43 confirmed. Possibly more I couldn't verify." Behind Grayson, Hastings made a sound. Not a word, not a gasp, something between the two. The sound a man makes when reality rearranges itself in front of him. 43, Grayson repeated. "Yes, sir." Cassidy swayed. The ground was tilting. "Permission to sit down, Commander. That climb it was rough." Grayson stepped forward and caught her arm before she could fall. Mercer took her other side. Hastings took her rifle. "Let's go home, Whisper," Grayson said. He'd used the nickname, but his voice had done something to it, stripped away the mockery, the dismissal, the years of casual cruelty that word had carried. When Grayson said it, it sounded like what it should have been from the beginning. A title, earned in blood and darkness and 43 shots that nobody should have been able to make. They helped her to the helicopter. She sat down on the metal floor, leaned against the bulkhead, and someone, she didn't see who, pressed a canteen into her hands. She drank. The water tasted like the best thing she'd ever put in her mouth. The Black Hawk lifted off. The valley fell away beneath them, the ridges and gorges shrinking to miniature. The place where 28 men almost died becoming just another fold in the endless Afghan terrain. Cassidy looked out through the open door. The sun was rising now, painting the peaks gold and red. She could see the shadow of their helicopter moving across the ground below. A dark shape racing over rocks and dust, carrying 5 people away from the worst night of their lives. Hastings sat down across from her. He looked at her for a long time without speaking. Then he said something she never expected to hear from him. "I'm sorry." "For what, Sergeant?" "For not seeing you. For 3 deployments I didn't see you. None of us did." Cassidy held his gaze. "You see me now?" "Yeah," Hastings nodded slowly. "Yeah, I see you now." She closed her eyes. The helicopter's vibration hummed through her body, and the exhaustion she'd been holding at bay for hours finally broke through her defenses like water through a cracked dam. She was asleep before they crossed the first ridge. She woke up in a hospital bed at Bagram Airfield with no memory of how she'd gotten there. The first thing Cassidy noticed was her hands. Both were wrapped in clean white bandages from fingertip to wrist, thick enough that her hands looked like boxing gloves. She tried to flex her fingers. The pain that shot through both arms made her suck air through her teeth and drop them back to the mattress. The second thing she noticed was Eddie Rowe sitting in a plastic chair beside her bed, asleep with his mouth open and his patrol cap pulled down over his eyes. "Eddie!" He jerked awake so fast he nearly fell out of the chair. "You're up. Oh, thank God you're up. The doctor said you might sleep for..." "How long?" 14 hours. They gave you something when they brought you in. You were..." "Cassidy, you were in bad shape. Your hands are torn up, both shoulders are strained, you're dehydrated, and you've got cuts all over your face and neck from rock fragments. But the doc says everything heals, nothing permanent. Ellison? Rose's face changed. Not grief, something adjacent to it. Surgery. He's still in surgery. They've been working on him for 7 hours. Torres got the tourniquet on right, kept him alive long enough to get to the table. They don't know yet. Ramos? Same. Surgery. He lost a lot of blood. They're giving him transfusions. Rowe paused. Cassidy, everyone else is alive. All 28. Injuries across the board, but everyone walked off those helicopters or got carried off breathing. Cassidy stared at the ceiling. 28 alive. Every number she'd carried on that cliff, every round she'd fired, every second she'd bought, it had been enough. The jammers, she said. Did you get through? About 10 minutes after the helicopters arrived, whatever you did up there knocked out enough of their positions that the jamming network collapsed. I got a signal through to Chapman, called in the QRF and the air assets. By the time I got through, the birds were already inbound. He stopped, looked at her with an expression she'd never seen from him before. You did it, Cassidy. You actually did it. We got lucky. That wasn't luck. 43 confirmed kills from an impossible position in 47 minutes? That's not luck. I don't know what that is, but it's not luck. A knock at the doorframe. Both of them looked up. Commander Grayson stood in the doorway. He'd changed uniforms, but the cut above his eye was stitched and taped, and he moved with the stiffness of a man whose body had been through something it wasn't going to forgive quickly. Behind him stood Hastings and Mercer. Lieutenant, Grayson said, you up for visitors? Yes, sir. Rose stood and started to leave. Grayson held up a hand. Stay, petty officer. You were part of this. Grayson pulled a chair to her bedside and sat down heavily. Mercer and Hastings stood behind him. For a moment, nobody spoke. The silence had weight, the kind of silence that happens when people are trying to find words for something that doesn't fit into words. I need to tell you something, Grayson said, and I need you to hear it because in about 3 hours you're going to be in a briefing room with a full bird colonel, and things are going to move fast. Sir? Colonel Sandra Mitchell, Task Force Vanguard Commander. She's read my preliminary after-action report, all 51 pages of it. She wants to see you personally. Am I being charged? The question landed like a grenade in the small room. Mercer flinched. Hastings looked at the floor. Rose's face went white. Grayson held her gaze. You disobeyed a direct order to maintain position. You conducted an unauthorized solo movement into hostile terrain. You engaged enemy forces without command authorization. By the book, Brennan, by the strict letter of military regulation, you could be facing a court-martial. I understand that, sir. I'm not finished. Grayson leaned forward. What I wrote in my report is that your actions constituted the single, most consequential individual combat performance I have witnessed or studied in 23 years of military service. I wrote that 28 men are alive because you made a decision that no regulation could have anticipated and no commander could have ordered. I wrote that you identified a developing ambush that our intelligence missed, that you warned command twice and were dismissed twice, and that when the situation became catastrophic, you took the only action that could save lives. He paused. I also wrote that if Colonel Mitchell charges you, I'll resign my commission in protest, and so will every man who was in that gorge. Commander, Hastings has already told me the same thing. Mercer, Webb, Torres, Morrison, every single operator, they'll all testify, not just for you, for the principle. The principle that when a soldier sees her people dying and has the capability to save them, following a bad order isn't honor, it's cowardice. Cassidy's throat was tight. She looked at Hastings, who nodded once. At Mercer, who gave her a look that said everything his mouth couldn't. You won't need to resign, sir, she said. Whatever happens, I'd make the same decision again. I know you would. That's why I'm recommending you for the Silver Star. 3 hours later, Cassidy sat in a briefing room at Bagram in a fresh uniform, her bandaged hands resting on the table in front of her. Colonel Sandra Mitchell sat at the head of the table, mid-50s, gray-streaked hair pulled back tight, the kind of face that had been making hard decisions for 30 years and showed every one of them. Around the table sat intelligence officers, tactical coordinators, senior enlisted personnel, and Commander Grayson. Captain Leo Hargrove was there too, seated at the far end. He hadn't looked at Cassidy since she'd entered the room. Mitchell had spent 20 minutes listening to Grayson's verbal summary. When he finished, she sat in silence for a full 30 seconds. Cassidy counted. Captain Rodriguez, Mitchell said, intelligence assessment. Captain Maria Rodriguez opened a folder. Based on recovered equipment, surveillance data, and signals intelligence, we're estimating 230 to 250 enemy fighters participated in the ambush. The operation was planned over a minimum of 3 weeks. They pre-positioned military-grade communications jammers, established coordinated fire positions, and constructed a kill zone specifically designed to neutralize a SEAL-sized element. This was a sophisticated operation. Extremely sophisticated, ma'am. Our assessment is that someone with professional military planning experience designed this ambush. The jammer placement alone required technical knowledge beyond typical insurgent capability. And Lieutenant Brennan's impact? 43 confirmed enemy casualties directly attributable to her engagement. But the tactical significance goes far beyond body count, ma'am. She eliminated their primary sniper, multiple squad and platoon leaders, at least 3 communications nodes, 2 mortar crews, 4 RPG teams, and their overall operational commander. She systematically dismantled their command and control structure from a position they didn't know existed. Rodriguez paused. Our assessment is unequivocal. Lieutenant Brennan's intervention was the decisive factor in the survival of the SEAL element. Without her actions, we would be writing 28 casualty notifications instead of sitting in this briefing. Mitchell turned to Hargrove. The captain's face was rigid. Captain Hargrove, you were tactical coordinator. Lieutenant Brennan reported staged village activity and hostile positions on the ridges. You dismissed both warnings. Your assessment now. Hargrove's jaw worked. The room was silent. Every eye was on him. I made an error in judgment, ma'am. The words came out like they were being pulled through broken glass. Lieutenant Brennan's tactical assessment was correct. She identified the ambush indicators that our intelligence platforms missed. I dismissed her concerns based on a lack of sensor confirmation. Based on a lack of sensor confirmation? Mitchell repeated. Or based on a lack of confidence in the officer making the report? The question hung in the air like a blade. Hargrove's face reddened. He looked at the table, at his hands, at anywhere that wasn't Cassidy Brennan or Colonel Mitchell. Both, ma'am, he said finally. I did not give Lieutenant Brennan's assessment the weight it deserved. I allowed my assumptions about her capability to influence my tactical judgment. That was wrong, and it nearly killed 28 people. Mitchell held him in her gaze for 3 more seconds. Then she turned to the room. Anyone in this room want to recommend disciplinary action against Lieutenant Brennan for disobeying Captain Hargrove's order to maintain position? Silence. Total, absolute silence. I didn't think so. Mitchell pressed the intercom. Send Lieutenant Brennan's personnel file to my office and get me division on a secure line. I need to discuss a commendation packet. She turned to Cassidy. Lieutenant, I'm going to be direct with you because that's how I operate, and I think that's how you operate too. Yes, ma'am. What you did was extraordinary. It was also completely outside the scope of your orders, your assignment, and arguably your authority. I could write you up. I won't, because regulations exist to serve the mission. And the mission that night was to bring those operators home alive. You accomplished that mission when no one else could. Mitchell slid a folder across the table. This is your new assignment. Primary Sniper, Tier 1 Direct Action Team. You're done with reconnaissance backwater postings. We've been wasting you, Lieutenant, and that stops today. Cassidy opened the folder, read the assignment orders. Her hands were shaking, not from exhaustion this time, from something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in 4 years of being overlooked and dismissed and told in 100 quiet ways that she didn't belong. Ma'am, this is a Tier 1 billet. Yes, it is. These positions are voluntary, high risk, and high operational tempo. The question is whether you want it. I accept, ma'am. Good. Mitchell stood. Everyone in the room stood with her. One more thing, Lieutenant. I want this engagement analyzed and incorporated into our tactical training curricula. The climbing route, the target selection methodology, the force multiplier prioritization, all of it. What you did on that cliff isn't just a war story, it's a new standard. Mitchell looked around the room. And I want it made very clear throughout this task force that operational capability has nothing to do with physical size or the volume of someone's personality. We judge people on performance. Lieutenant Brennan just set the bar. I expect everyone to take note. She left. The room exhaled. Grayson walked Cassidy to the door. In the hallway, he stopped. How are the hands? They hurt. They'll heal. You know what Hastings told me this morning? What? He said he spent 3 deployments calling you Whisper like it was a joke. He said watching you work that ridge was like watching someone prove that everything he thought he knew about what makes a good operator was wrong. Hastings said that? Word for word. He also said if anyone ever uses that nickname as an insult again, they'll answer to him personally. Cassidy didn't know what to say to that. For years, the nickname had been a weight she carried, a constant, low-grade reminder that she didn't fit, didn't belong, wasn't enough. Hearing that it had changed meaning felt like setting down a rucksack she'd been carrying for so long she'd forgotten it was there. Commander, she said, what about Hargrove? Grayson's expression hardened. Mitchell's handling it. He won't be coordinating tactical operations anymore. He's being moved to a staff position where his judgment calls can't get people killed. He's not a bad officer. No, he's an officer who let his assumptions override his training. That's worse than bad, Brennan. Bad officers make mistakes from ignorance. Hargrove made his from arrogance. He heard a woman he'd already decided wasn't worth listening to, and he stopped listening before her first sentence was finished. He won't be the last. No, he won't. But the next one will have this after-action report on his desk, and he'll have to explain why he ignored the same kind of warning that nearly wiped out a SEAL platoon in Shahi Khat Valley. They walked outside. The Afghan sun was brutal, white and heavy and relentless. Cassidy squinted against it. What now, sir? Now you heal. Your new team leader will contact you in 72 hours. Master Chief Derek Nash. He runs a Tier 1 element, small team, high-end missions. He's read your file and my report. He asked for you specifically. He asked for me? By name, Brennan, by name. Cassidy nodded. 72 hours. Enough time for her hands to start healing, for her shoulders to unknot, for the adrenaline sickness to work its way out of her system. Enough time to call her father. She found a satellite phone that evening. The connection took 3 tries, bouncing signals off satellites halfway around the world to reach a house in the Beartooth Mountains of Montana. When her father's voice came through, rough and warm and familiar, Cassidy had to press the phone hard against her ear to stop her hands from shaking. Hey, Dad. Cass. A pause. He could hear something in her voice. He always could. What happened? She told him. Not the classified details. She couldn't share those. But the shape of it. The ambush. The cliff. The shooting. The descent. She spoke for 20 minutes, and her father listened the way he'd always listened. Completely, without interruption, absorbing every word the way rock absorbs rain. When she finished, the line was quiet for a long time. "You climbed a Class 5 face in combat," Jack Brennan said. "In the dark. Loaded." "The rock was terrible, Dad. Shale in the last section. The whole face was rotten." "But you read it." "I tried." "You didn't try, Cass. You did it. 120 meters up, the shelf collapsed. You told me that. You fell. And you caught yourself on a hold the size of my fist, and you kept climbing." His voice was thick. "Do you understand what that means?" "It means I got lucky." "No, it means I raised a daughter who, when she's falling off a cliff in the dark with 28 lives depending on her, reaches out and grabs the rock instead of giving up. That's not luck. That's who you are. Dad, I'm proud of you. Not because of the medal they're going to give you or the stories people are going to tell. I'm proud because when it mattered, when it really mattered, you did what needed doing. That's all I ever tried to teach you. Just do what needs doing when it needs doing." "I was scared the whole time." "Of course you were. Being scared and doing it anyway. That's what courage actually is. Everything else is just recklessness." Cassidy pressed the phone against her ear. 14,000 miles of distance between them, satellites and radio waves in the curve of the earth. And somehow her father's voice was the closest thing in the world. "I love you, Dad." "I love you too, little one. Now get some rest. You sound like you haven't slept in a week." "Close." "Then sleep. The mountains will still be there when you wake up." After the call, Cassidy walked to the barracks roof. The sun was setting behind the Afghan mountains, the same mountains that had almost killed her 36 hours ago. She sat down on the concrete and looked west. Word was already spreading through the base. She could feel it. The shifted glances in the chow hall, the conversations that stopped when she walked past, the way operators she'd never met nodded at her in the corridors. The military grapevine moved fast, and the story of Shahi Kot Valley was moving faster than most. She wasn't sure how she felt about it. For 4 years, she'd been invisible. Now she was something else entirely, and the transition from one to the other had happened so violently, so abruptly, that part of her was still standing on that cliff, still looking down at the battlefield, still squeezing the trigger. A door opened behind her. Footsteps. Someone sat down beside her on the concrete. Torres, the medic, still wearing scrubs stained with someone else's blood. "Ellison's out of surgery," Torres said. 11 hours on the table. He's going to lose the leg below the knee, but he's alive." "And Ramos?" Torres smiled. It was the kind of smile that came after 12 hours of fighting for someone's life and winning. "He's going to make it. The surgeon said another 10 minutes without blood supply, and they'd have lost him. Your tourniquet call, telling me over the radio to tighten it, that bought him those 10 minutes. "I didn't tell you to tighten anything. Your radio was jammed." "Not my radio." Rowe relayed it when the signal came back. "He said you told him before you started climbing. If Torres needs to retighten Ellison's tourniquet, tell her not to hesitate." Cassidy didn't remember saying that. The minutes before the climb were a blur of map reading and fear and the cold mathematics of survival. But maybe she had. Maybe that was the kind of thing her mind did when the rest of her was focused on not dying. It kept working the problem, kept counting the lives, kept looking for ways to save people she might never reach. "Thank you," Torres said. "From me, from Ellison, from Ramos, from everyone." She paused. "And from Ellison's wife. She called the hospital. She wanted me to tell whoever saved her husband's life that their daughter was born 3 weeks ago. Her name is Maya. Jake Ellison has never held his daughter. Now he will." Cassidy couldn't speak. She opened her mouth and nothing came out. 4 years of being overlooked. 4 years of swallowed frustration and quiet competence and proving herself to people who refused to look. And now a baby she'd never met would grow up with a father because of what she'd done on a cliff in the dark. Torres put her hand on Cassidy's shoulder, squeezed once, and left. Cassidy sat alone on the roof. The last light was fading. The first stars were appearing, the same stars visible from her father's porch in Montana, where he was probably sitting right now, coffee in hand, looking up at the same sky. She thought about Maya Ellison, 3 weeks old, a father she'd almost never known. She thought about Danny Ramos, 22 years old, a life that had almost ended before it really started. She thought about 28 men who were calling their families tonight instead of being carried home under flags. And she thought about a word, a nickname, a small, dismissive label that had followed her for 4 years like a shadow she couldn't shake. Whisper. It didn't hurt anymore. Something had happened to it on that cliff. In the wind, in the darkness, in the 43 shots that nobody believed she could make. The word had been melted down and reforged into something new. Something that belonged to her instead of being used against her. Down in the barracks below, she could hear operators talking, laughing. The sounds of men who were alive when they shouldn't be, doing the ordinary human things that combat makes extraordinary. Eating bad food, telling bad jokes, calling home. One voice carried up through the open window, clear enough for Cassidy to hear. You hear about Brennan? 43 kills from a cliff they said couldn't be climbed. In the dark, with 14 rounds in her first mag. I heard Nash already requested her for his team. Good. That woman's the real deal. Should have been on a Tier 1 element years ago. A pause, then, quieter. We called her Whisper like it was a punchline. Turns out the punchline was on us. Cassidy closed her eyes. The stars burned overhead. The mountains held their silence. Somewhere on this base, Jake Ellison was alive because of her. Danny Ramos was alive because of her. 26 other men were alive because a woman nobody took seriously climbed a cliff that couldn't be climbed and did the thing that needed doing. She sat there until the stars filled the whole sky. Then she stood up, went downstairs, and went to sleep. Master Chief Derek Nash was not what Cassidy expected. He was short, 5'7", maybe 5'8" in boots, compact, weathered face, cropped gray hair, hands that looked like they'd been built from rope and sandpaper. He moved through the operations center at Bagram like a man who owned every room he walked into. Not with arrogance, but with the quiet authority of someone who'd been tested so many times that doubt had simply burned out of him. He found Cassidy in the recovery ward on her 3rd day, still wearing bandages on both hands, still moving like someone whose shoulders hadn't forgiven her. Brennan, Master Chief. He pulled a chair to her bedside, sat down and studied her for 10 seconds without speaking. Cassidy held his gaze. She'd spent 4 years being looked through. Being looked at was different. Nash wasn't evaluating her body or her size. He was reading something deeper, the thing behind the eyes that told an experienced operator whether the person in front of them could be trusted when everything went wrong. I read your file, Nash said. Top scores in sniper qualification, top scores in land navigation, mountaineering certifications that half my climbers don't have, 4 deployments, 0 disciplinary issues, consistent excellence ratings. He paused. And 4 years of being assigned to reconnaissance overwatch while operators with half your scores took primary positions. Yes, Master Chief. Why didn't you fight it? The question surprised her. Sir, you had the scores, you had the qualifications. You could have filed complaints, requested transfers, gone through the Inspector General. Why didn't you? Cassidy thought about it, really thought about it. Not the practiced answer she'd given herself over 4 years, but the real one. Because I thought if I was good enough, eventually someone would notice. Nash nodded slowly. And nobody did. Not until Shah-e-Khat. That's the system's failure, Brennan, not yours. I want you to understand that. What happened to your career for 4 years? That was people failing you. You didn't fail anyone. He leaned forward. Now, my team. I run a 6-person element, high-end direct action. We take the missions nobody else wants, and we bring everybody home. I don't care about your size. I don't care about your volume. I care about one thing. What's that? Can you do the job when it's the worst night of your life and everything's falling apart and the plan's gone to hell? Cassidy looked at her bandaged hands. I think I already answered that question, Master Chief. Nash almost smiled. Yeah, you did. He stood up. 72 hours. Get your hands working. Report to Building 7 at 0600. We've got a mission cycle starting, and I need my sniper. Your sniper? My sniper? That's what you are now, Brennan. That's what you should have been from day one. He left. Cassidy stared at the empty doorway for a long time. Then she looked down at her bandaged hands and started working her fingers. Open, close, open, close. It hurt. She kept going. The first mission with Nash's team was a compound raid in Coast Province. Weapons cache. Suspected IED manufacturing facility. Cassidy was positioned on Overwatch 300 meters from the target, the same distance she'd been assigned on every previous deployment. But everything else was different. Ghost, you have eyes on? Nash's voice came through her earpiece. Calm, professional, trusting. Affirm, all clear on approach vectors. 2 sentries, north and east, both stationary. Copy, execute on your mark, Ghost. On your mark. 3 words that changed everything. Nash was giving her the authority to call the timing of the assault based on her sniper perspective. He was trusting her judgment, her eyes, her read of the situation. The sentries shifted positions. A gap opened, 4 seconds where both were facing away from the approach route. Execute, Cassidy said. Nash's team moved like water through a crack, silent, fast, precise. The breach was clean. The compound was secured in 90 seconds. 0 casualties. Objectives achieved. Afterward, during debrief, Nash pulled her aside. Good calls tonight. Your timing on the execute was perfect. Thank you, Master Chief. Don't thank me. Just do it again tomorrow. And the day after. Consistency, Brennan. That's what separates a great operator from a great story. Shahi Khat made you famous. What you do next makes you real. She took that to heart. Over the following months, Cassidy deployed on 17 combat operations with Nash's element. Not all were dramatic. Most were the methodical, disciplined work of professionals executing difficult missions in hostile territory. Overwatch positions, precision engagements, target identification. The quiet, unglamorous labor of a sniper who does her job so well that the men below her never have to know how close they came to dying. But word spread. Other units requested her by name. Commanders who'd never met her asked for her assessment on approach routes and engagement plans. The after-action report from Shahi Khat circulated through special operations channels, and with it spread a reputation that had nothing to do with luck and everything to do with what Nash had demanded. Consistency. The nickname followed her. Whisper. But it had completed its transformation. On Nash's team, it wasn't mockery, it was identity. The call sign that came through the earpiece before an operation went right. The voice that said, execute, and meant it. The phantom on the ridge that the enemy never saw and never heard until it was too late. 14 months after Shahi Khat, Cassidy sat in the Bagram Chow Hall eating alone. Not from loneliness, from preference. She'd always been comfortable with silence, and 4 years of being ignored had turned solitude from a burden into a refuge. A tray slid onto the table across from her. Commander Grayson sat down. He was thinner than she remembered, harder around the eyes. The cut above his eyebrow had healed into a thin, white scar that he'd carry for the rest of his life. Mind if I join you, Lieutenant? Of course not, sir. They ate in silence for 2 minutes, comfortable silence, the kind shared by people who've been through something together that can't be reduced to small talk. I'm rotating home next week, Grayson said. Before I go, I need to ask you something I've been carrying for 14 months. Sir? That night, on the cliff, When you started climbing, what were you actually thinking? Not the tactical assessment, not the operational calculation. What was going through your head? Cassidy set down her fork. She thought about lying, thought about giving the clean, professional answer. I assessed the situation and determined that intervention was necessary. The kind of answer that looked good in reports and briefings and medal citations. But Grayson had been in the gorge. He'd said the words she'd heard through rose scope. We're not getting out of this gorge alive. He deserved the truth. I was thinking that following orders meant watching 28 people die. People I knew, people with families, and I couldn't do it. She paused. I was also thinking that I'd spent 4 years proving myself to people who refused to see me, and that if I was going to die, I'd rather die trying to save them than sitting on a ridge being obedient and useless. You were angry. Yes, sir, I was angry. Good. Grayson said it like he meant it. Anger's underrated in this business. Not the hot kind, the cold kind. The kind that makes you climb a cliff that can't be climbed because somebody told you to sit down and shut up. Commander, I wasn't trying to prove anything. I know. That's what makes it different. You weren't trying to prove anything. You were trying to save lives. The proof just came along for the ride. He pushed his tray aside. I'm putting you in for promotion. Captain's bars. Sir, it's not up for discussion. You've been operating at a level that demands appropriate rank. Nash agrees. Mitchell agrees. The promotion board meets next month. I don't know what to say. Say you'll keep doing exactly what you've been doing. Say you'll keep being the person who sees the ambush before it happens and acts when no one tells her to. Say you'll keep being Whisper. Cassidy looked at him. This man who'd been minutes from death in a gorge, who'd been the last man on the ground, who'd come back for her in a helicopter because leaving her behind was something he couldn't live with. I will, sir. Grayson stood, reached across the table, shook her bandaged hand, gently, carefully, with the deliberateness of someone sealing a promise. Ellison's daughter started crawling last week, he said. Maya. He sent pictures to everyone in the unit. Cute kid. I know, he sent them to me too. He named his daughter's middle name after you. Maya Cassidy Ellison. Did you know that? She didn't know that. The information hit her somewhere below the ribs, in the place where she kept the things that mattered most. A baby girl in Virginia with her name. A life that existed because of 43 shots from a cliff that couldn't be climbed. No, she whispered. I didn't know that. Grayson nodded once, then he walked away. Cassidy sat alone in the chow hall. Around her, operators ate and laughed and complained about the food and called home and did all the ordinary things that soldiers do between the extraordinary moments that define their service. She finished her meal, walked outside. The sun was setting behind the mountains, the same sky, the same country that had almost killed her and instead had made her into someone she didn't know she could be. Her radio crackled. Whisper, operations, briefing in 10, mission spinning up, need your assessment on approach routes. Copy, ops, on my way. She started walking toward the operations center. Her boots crunched on gravel. The evening air was cool against her face. Above her, the first stars were appearing. The same stars her father was watching from his porch in Montana. The same stars that had witnessed her climbing a cliff in the dark. The same stars that didn't care whether you were big or small, loud or quiet, noticed or invisible. The stars only cared about what you did when it mattered. And when it had mattered most, when 28 men were dying in a gorge, and the radios were dead, and no one was coming, and the only path to salvation was a cliff that couldn't be climbed, Cassidy Brennan had stood up, stripped her pack, and started climbing. Not because anyone ordered her to, not because anyone believed she could, not because she was trying to prove that a quiet woman from Montana belonged in a world that had spent 4 years telling her she didn't. She climbed because 28 men needed her, and she was the only one who could reach them. That was enough. That had always been enough. Sometimes the quietest voice in the room is the one that saves every life in it. Sometimes the person everyone overlooks is the only person who sees the truth. And sometimes the woman they called Whisper turns out to be the loudest thing on the battlefield. Not because she shouted, but because every single shot she fired said what words never could. I am here, I see you, and I will not let you die.